So welcome everyone. As Allison said, my name is Simone Gamble, the founder of OAARS. I use they and them and she and her pronouns. If you do not know OAARS, I hope you will today. We are a consultancy of folks of color who do social justice center trainings and education around how to create safer, equitable, and inclusive workplaces. But I'm also a proud member of the Summer Camp Society faculty. And so I'm excited to continue to provide these free and accessible resources for you all for camps. So thank you TSCS for this platform. A little bit about me. If you don't know my story, a lot of you probably have, and this is repetitive, but for my new folks, I've been going to camp since I was really young, since I was 10 years old. I was a part of day camps. I grew up in the Bronx, New York. My mom was a huge advocate for education and was like, you are going to go to school and then you're going to go to extended school, which is camp. But for me, it was fun and learning at the same time. And out of all my siblings, I have 6 brothers and 2 sisters. I was one of the few who took to camp and found myself, found my personality, found some of my best community there. And then at 18, I decided I wanted to continue that work and became a counselor at a camp in upstate New York called Camp Fiverr, where I was a counselor, a specialist, and an assistant camp director. So I was there for 10 years and then eventually transitioned into consulting. And in my transition into consulting, I realized there was a need for me to reflect on my own camp experiences in the spaces that were phenomenal and wonderful and still are with me to this day. But at the same time, if I'm trying to help leaders become better, I had to reflect on the spaces that were not so comfortable, that were not so pleasant, that stuck with me as well. And maybe I may have pushed to the back of my mind because I thought camp was this utopia. And I had to break down my utopia thinking a little bit and say, okay, how can we create camps that are this beautiful, magical space, but do it with our eyes open so everyone has a magical experience regardless of their identity. And as I began to work with camps, something started to come up. People were like, well, how do we keep this work going outside of the trainings that we do in staff training? How do we continue to do the work on an ongoing basis and make it the water that we all swim in every single day instead of just a single check the box workshop? And as I continue to do that work, this idea of a JEDI Rapid Response Team popped into my head. And I want to give credit to Camp Scatterco, who we're working with probably for 2 years now, who was the first group I actually pitched it to and is starting to do the work and actually is in their 2nd year of having folks apply. So I just want to shout them out that this was a collaborative experience. And so rapid response teams at camp, it sounds like something that happens, like an incident happens and then we respond to it. But I want us to know that this is not just a responsive tool, which many times JEDI, which will define, that's the practice that we have. But I want us to also know that this can also be used as a preventative tool. For me, the key to creating safer spaces and reducing harm is always prevention. It's better to prevent things than to respond. But if we have to respond, what are the structures we are creating to make sure that happens in a mindful way? Just some community norms, even though I usually do it for interactive ones, it still can apply here for a webinar. Active listening and participation. Participating just means having me on your screen, listening in, turning off distractions if you can. If not, listening to the recording after. Acknowledge your intent and understand impact. We don't have to worry about that one just yet for today. And then be okay with non-closure. We only have an hour to talk about such a big structure. So this is the beginning of the conversation, and we hope that you reach out to us and other Summer Camp Society folks for support if this is something you want to institute in your own camp. So before I get into what the rapid response looks like, I wanted to give a base definition for you all for what JEDI means according to myself and OAARS. And I'll talk about what it is and what it is not. So diversity, I'm not going to read each one just for time, but diversity is the presence of differences that includes race, gender, class, ability, all these other tenets of our social identities, right? It describes a group of people. What diversity is not is tokenism. It's saying we just need to have 10 more staff of color and 5 more queer staff, and we are a diverse place. It is bigger than that. It's seeing people in their full humanity and making sure that they are, secondly, included, which we'll talk about, They're seen, heard, and honored. So inclusion is a state of not only feeling, but belonging and working where diversity is valued, where people feel people feel seen, heard, respected, and most of all, safe. What inclusion is not is integration, is where we have this homogenous group of people, this dominant culture, and then you're bringing in diversity and having those folks assimilate into what's already there. Inclusion asks us to kind of break up that homogeneity, break up that dominant narrative, and include those voices into creating a culture that works for everyone, not just integrating them into the space. Equity is a space of impartiality and fairness within procedures, processes, and distribution of resources inside a community or organization. And tackling equity requires an understanding of the root causes of oppression. So for me, equity makes you make the clear distinction of making sure you acknowledge historical root causes of oppression and making sure that that is a part of your equity. It's not just saying like, what do communities not have now, but what do individuals and communities, what have they been denied since the beginning of time? It's in talking about the historical ramifications of why things exist to this day. Are people poor now just because of individual decisions and policies now, or is there a historical reason why that's happening? And what are we doing to fill those gaps based on need? What equity is not is equality. It is not saying that we all have the same needs and giving everybody the same thing. That is not equality. That will only advance those who have the most. And justice is removing the barriers that prevent all these pieces from happening in the first place. It is challenging and changing the root causes of this disparity across all aspects of society. And so for me, what justice is not is keeping our power, is staying comfortable with the status quo. Sometimes justice means breaking down your power, removing yourself from power, or challenging power. So justice is not comfortable for everyone. But in the end, we all benefit, which we don't always think about. So what is JEDI Rapid Response? It is an immediate acknowledgement, validation, and resolution of an issue with an intersectional approach and the intent to address said issues in a timely manner, rooted in the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so to break that down, basically you're acknowledging the harm that's happening, not ignoring it, not pushing it under the rug because you don't have time for it or you think it'll ruffle feathers. It means coming up with the resolution. And what I mean by intersectional approach is that you're taking count of all the different players that are happening in the situation. How does identity come up? How does power come up? How does privilege come up? And using intersectionality, which you should definitely look up as a concept, and see how that is coming into play. How does your role come into play in addressing the situation? How do the people who've enacted the harm or felt the harm, how does that come into play? And then doing it in a timely manner through the lens of the definitions we gave of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And the reason I'm using rapid response is because sometimes we have camps where these incidents have happened and nothing gets done. It doesn't mean that it needs to be, okay, an incident happened, we need to resolve it in 2 minutes, 2 minutes later. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it needs to be addressed in general in a really mindful way. And the reason we want a team of folks is we think about how do we include way more voices than we have just on our senior leadership, because sometimes those voices represent dominant narratives, sometimes they represent power, sometimes they're the issue. So how do we have a different group of folks to come up with a solution that hits all these different perspectives? Okay, the first step, before you even think about even instituting this, you need to get buy-in, because it takes a huge investment to actually make this happen and bring it into fruition. So these are just some of the stakeholders that you need to have on board in order to make this successful. If you skip getting buy-in, the JEDI Rapid Response Team is not going to be fully invested in. It's going to flop probably for the year because there's no structural procedures to have people really make sure this happens or keep it accountable or have staff dedicated to it. So if you get buy-in, all these pieces will start to fall into place because you'll have the monetary investment, you'll have the staff investment, you have buy-in, and it'll become a bigger piece of the culture at your camp. And so the first group, of course, is the board. I'm not saying they're the most important group, but they're one of the first groups you should definitely address. Because moving forward, we talk about incentivizing being a part of this team, and sometimes that looks like money. Sometimes it's adding more money to this, to the check of the person who is participating in this team, because it takes extra effort. I know camps are sometimes strapped. So if you cannot do money, I encourage you to get highly creative on what that looks like. But when it comes to DEI work, sometimes it is not prioritized as something that should be paid, but it's emotional labor to be able to do this work. And so that should come with some extra incentives. So you have to get buy-in from your board, explain to them why this is important, how this can not only help your bottom line, which it will, because it'll prevent incidents and prevent people from not wanting to return to your camp because you're having these incidents and not addressing it, but how can it actually help the culture? How can it invite in new families? How can it invite in new people? How can it actually help to improve the public reputation that your camp has, that you are actually living up to your DEI principles? Second, you have to get buy-in from staff, because there's some of the people who are going to be really facilitating these discussions and being a part of the team. So if you get them on board, that'll be super helpful, because you'll get people filling out the applications and understanding that this needs to be infused into every facet of camp. You also have to get both new and veteran. There might be some people who are like, why do we need this? Camp is perfect. Camp is my utopia, my safe space. Why are we changing it? So you also have to provide a space to get those staff who may have been there for a while and be like, this is not an attack on your traditions or what camp is. This is a way to make it a safe space for everyone. The fact that you come to camp and are instantly provided a safe space, that should not be novel to you. That should be something that we all get. And this team helps you to get to that space. And hopefully they will understand that. If they still push back, think about, is this a space for them as well? Next up, definitely getting campers involved too, because especially older campers, because it will become a part of the process, especially in responding to certain incidents. Letting them know that there's this body that is created to help create a safer space would be amazing. And some folks have even considered adding campers to the list of people who can be involved in the JEDI Rapid Response Team, which I think is super powerful, because they're the people on the ground who are directly impacted by some of these decisions. And last but not least, parents, just letting them know that this is a new piece of work that you'll be instituting. Some people have also included parents, so the active parent who's like, okay, what's going on? How can I support? I think that's pretty powerful as well too, but just knowing that the hierarchy in that space needs to be really clear, so adult voices don't drown out youth voices, which should always be centered in this work. So getting buy-in is the first step. Next one is to determine your purpose. Let me just take a quick sip of water. The next one is to determine your purpose, right? So we think of rapid response, we think of them just responding to incidents, but that doesn't have to be the nature of what your rapid response team does. You can even change it to JEDI team and take out rapid response, so there's no sense of urgency around it. That's just the word I gave it. It does not need to be that for your camp. You know your camp better than I do. But what we have here is a list of different ways, different purposes that your team can take. The first one is my favorite one, of course, a preventative body. How are we making this body of people be responsible for training, both during staff training, but in service training, continuous training around how do we unlearn systems of oppression? How do we talk about difficult issues that might come up? How do we train staff if they're dealing with the persistent issue around like bias or microaggressions? How are they becoming a preventative body? That also looks like creating spaces of community building, of getting to know each other, because the more you know a community, less incidents of the kinds around equity and inclusion will happen. So they can do both learning and unlearning spaces. They can be community builders. They can, which will all be a preventative body. The next one is implementation of JEDI structures, right? So how can they think about some of the initiatives that y'all have around justice, equity, and inclusion at camp, and how can they support in implementing that? Is it something that they create, or is it something that you co-create together and they're actually implementing it? If you had a dream of creating new traditions, they can support in implementing that. If you had a dream of creating a social justice curriculum that goes along with your programming, they could be responsible for creating that. So they can be responsible for creating the goals and implementing it, depending on the scope that you want this group to have. And it's important to be clear on the scope of power that you're giving this group before you even start it, which we'll talk about later. The next one is the response piece, is responding to incidents of harm related to DEI. So getting some folks trained in restorative justice, which I know Summer Camp Society has some great links to, and probably some webinars that you can watch around restorative justice. So having them trained in doing restorative circles, having them trained in conflict mediation when harm happens, that's related specifically to DEI. Not every fight you're going to give them to the JEDI team. Some things are above what they can handle, but if it's particular to these things, definitely think about how they can respond to those. And sometimes young people actually respond better to particular staff or even other campers if they're on the team than they would to like a senior leader of membership. So this might actually be a helpful tool when thinking about conflict resolution and behavior management at your camp. The next one is a project-based body to work towards a more inclusive and equitable camp. So when they become a team, they can come up with like 1 or 2 projects that they want to implement at camp, and that will be their goal for the whole summer. Is there one particular project that you want them to work on to make your camp even more inclusive and equitable? For example, they could be like, we want to translate all the signage around camp to have 2 or 3 additional languages to make sure anyone who speaks any language that comes to this camp has a safe space, and that could be their project. But make sure they have power in creating what that is, because they know what they need best. And especially if you're including campers, that's an even more powerful moment for them, because they're literally adding to shifting camp to become a more safer space, not only for them, but for generations to come. The next one is an auditing body. I know auditing doesn't sound fun and cute, but it can be if people are really interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But that looks like folks looking at traditions, folks looking at songs, folks looking at meals, folks looking at handbooks, folks looking at all of my broken nails. All of you looking at all the pieces of camp that you can say, is this a space that is actually inclusive of everyone? Is there hidden curriculum here? Is this a space that is actually equitable? Do we all experience this activity or this song or this tradition the same? Allow them to audit camp and be like, this space doesn't actually need to exist anymore. Or how can we amend this space? Or how can we create new traditions? And so you can have them be an auditing body to constantly evaluate camp in its present state and see what can be changed. And some folks really enjoy that work too. So if you know that's the feeling that you want to get from this team, you can include that as well. Decision-making body to support with decisions. So if you're making decisions around policies, around structures, around different things, you can have them be like a consulting group that can support you, making sure that it's through an equity-based lens. So as a senior leadership, if you're deciding like, we want to figure out how to make our meals more inclusive, you can think about including this JEDI team as a helpful decision-making body to support with those decisions. So you make sure that you have different perspectives included in the work. And then last but not least, I've mentioned this before, but a restorative justice body. How are they helping to include restorative justice practices, not only when conflict happens, but even before it happens? How do we create a restorative approach to how we do everything in that space? But that takes definite training and people who are well-versed in that practice. And so in the determining your purpose part, it's really important to know exactly what you want this body to be. You can even have the team determine, what do y'all want to be? How do you want to do the work that you are dedicated to this summer? And the more that they have ownership over that and power over that, they will go all in for this work. And also give them the option to be 2 things, 3 things, whatever is within their scope, because doing one is a lot. But if they have the capacity, if they want to be a preventative body and an auditing body, let them know the parameters of that work, and then let them decide what makes sense for them. Okay, this one is really hard and something that we're still figuring out. So just know none of this work is like researched, and well, at least not the work that I'm doing now. I'm pretty sure people have created rapid response teams, and there's a ton of research that I can like tap into. But based on the case studies that I have now, I need to do my own personal research, of course. It's really hard determining your participants sometimes because you want to be able to include the voices that are most marginalized because they're closest to the solution and experience some of the not so great effects of camp, but you don't want to force people to do it. And sometimes that might mean but that might mean less space for other voices that might be involved. But what we're working on for future summers, which is not a part of this presentation, is some sort of rubric that is not biased based on you knowing the staff member or the campers or the other applicants or the amount of years that they've been at camp or their ability to write well. So we're coming up with a rubric around how do we create an application process and a selection process that is not rooted in bias, but also centering the people that really need to be in that space. And so we have not created that yet, but that should be coming. And hopefully for a webinar next summer, that could be something we present to you all. But these are just some quick tips around if you're getting this work started. I put on the right a social identity map. So these are the places where people identify. This is the place where people identify. So it's about race, sexual orientation, gender. So you do kind of a mapping as part of your application process, which we will be sending out as an asset, and figure out like what voices do we need in this room, and you might have to weigh that a little bit more than other voices. And so do social identity mapping as part of your application, which we have included. We included all the demographics along with definitions because people need to know what these words mean. And you have to communicate to people as they're applying that you will be centering certain voices and certain experiences, just so they know, and the reason why. Because if they don't know why, it will seem very biased and unfair, which is why a rubric is definitely needed. The second one is once you do a social identity mapping of all the people that are applying, you have to figure out who is at the margins and who needs to be centered. That question, who's at the margins, is just who is usually missing from the table. And most of the time, those are folks who are people of color, who are queer, who are trans, or gender variant, neurodivergent. Think about those voices who need to be centered. The next one, which is a very fine line, is being aware of tokenization. So for me, that looks like, okay, we definitely need a Black person on the team. How do we get them in? Instead of being like, what can a person of color or a Black person bring to the table? How can we see them in their full humanity instead of just as a token? Because if they're just tokenized, they cannot speak for their entire race or ethnicity. That is unfair of them to ask, and that puts a lot of pressure on that person. So beware of tokenization. I always say to also prioritize both alumni and fresh voices. I think there's always a natural skew to inviting alumni voices into the space because they know camp best, they can do this work, they know camp inside and out. But sometimes those fresh eyes actually see way more than alumni because they're not part of the hidden curriculum that happens a lot of times at camp. So it's really important to include those fresh voices because they can see camp through new eyes and see spots that are gaps for you all that have been hidden for years because you've just been going there for so long. Some of the, like, I remember joining a new workplace and I saw so many gaps that were happening and people were like, I never knew that was a gap until you said it. So really think about how you include fresh voices and new faces into this work as well. And of course you need alumni because they can speak to the culture of camp. They can explain the meaning behind certain traditions and certain policies. So you need a mix of both. The next one is think about people new to this work, which I mentioned before, and think about how you prioritize people with lived and studied experience on this topic, a varied skill set. So you may have people who are like, I went to college and I study equity, inclusion, and justice, and this is my passion. You definitely need those folks in the room, but you also need people in the room who are like, well, I'm a queer person and I've experienced homophobia firsthand. You also need those voices in the room who can say, I may not have studied it, but I have lived it. Because those are both really important pieces of knowledge that you need in the room if you're talking about building out a JEDI team. So make sure not to prioritize folks who may know the language, but have not lived the life. You need both and. Okay, Now we are at the application process, and it's really important to also be mindful of how equity, inclusion, and access is showing up even in the application process. Because sometimes, depending on how you do it, you could be eliminating groups that actually need to be a part of this process. And so you, in turn, also have to be thinking about embodying equity, inclusion, and justice, and even how you think about how to do the application process. So the first one is making sure that it is accessible. So is it only online? Is it only tech friendly? What if families or individuals don't have access to tech? Is there a paper version that you can give out or share out or mail out? Language, is it translated for folks? Do you know who you're sending it to? And are you providing that option for translation that makes sense? Are you defining terms? So sometimes we put like on a application, we put name, age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all these things, but sometimes people don't know what that means, or they don't have a clear definition of what it is. And so how are we also in the application process defining those terms for them? Because that's also a piece of education that they're getting as they're applying to this too. And on the application asset that I'll be giving, I've defined all those terms for you. So you'll have that already ready to go once that gets sent out. The next one is making sure that it's transparent. Let them know exactly what they're getting into, because they can see, let's say if you do offer a financial incentive, they can see, oh, we get $300 more on our check, but they don't know that it's a lot of work. So really explain every piece of the work that they're going to be engaging in. I provide a job description, but that could be even doubled based on what you think this body will be, and it will change based on their purpose that you determine based on what we talked about earlier. So provide that, the extent of what the work would be. Provide context, honest context, like why are we starting this work now? What has been going on historically? And that means you have to be transparent and vulnerable about what's been happening at your camp. Not only the good, but some of the hard things that have been happening. Why do we need to start this team now? And if you're on this call, it was because maybe there was a time where you wish you had a JEDI team to respond to this in the moment. So be honest, be like, we are a magical place, but in being a magical place, we have things that we need to work on. We have folks who've experienced incidents of harm, like be really honest about that. So people understand that if you're transparent, at least in the application, that this work is going to be honest too. The second one is thinking about the extent of power. Some folks create it and they're like, yeah, this is cute. But when they start challenging real things, and when they start auditing real things, and when they start suggesting real trainings, folks are like, whoa, 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 we didn't say you could do all that. So be mindful that if you are starting this team, you need to be mindful of how you hold on to power, because this team will challenge your power in one way or another. And so think about how much power you want to give this group. If it's limited, maybe don't start it at all, because if people are given fake access to power, you lose trust, and this work will be hard to pick up again. And you want to have trust at the basis of this. The next one, I talked about the commitment. What is the actual commitment? Be clear, like, is it an additional 4 hours of work? Are they going to be doing in the morning, after lunch? Be clear about what that commitment looks like. Incentives, are they getting more money? Are they getting a time off? Are they getting like cool t-shirts, like a JEDI Rapid Response Team t-shirt? Ooh, that's kind of cute. That'd be great for some people to make. And then lastly, modes of evaluation. How are we evaluating the success of this program? You can have them create an evaluation, you can create one, or collaborate on creating one, because it's important to know if this group is actually having an impact. Because if not, maybe it's not something you want to continue. Maybe it needs to shift directions. The next one is to have a consultant or have a third party look at the language and see if it's unintentionally rooting people out. So I have multiple eyes on the application. Is there a word? Is there a phrase? Is there a particular question that might be rooting people out? On the application that we're sharing, there might be things that I created that are rooting people out. Sometimes folks can't fill out an application. For me, it's extremely difficult because I have ADHD. It's extremely difficult for me to sit down and fill out an application with 10 questions. The one I'm giving you all has 10 questions, and it's a lot of questions, a lot of words. So maybe you can offer the same 10 questions, but you can say, you can give it to us in video form, or you can give it to us in short sentences or an outline. Like, allow people to share those answers in different ways so they can be able to show up in their best self. For me, if you ask me to answer that on video, I can do that in a second. But if I have to write it out, that's going to take a lot more time. So allow different modes of responses from people based on their particular needs. And you can have a space where you can say, if you want to talk about accessibility needs with this, please do reach out to us. The next one is, which we talked about earlier, which is not created just yet, is to create some kind of simple rubric to help remove bias or favoritism and tokenism, which we'll hopefully have developed sometime very, very soon. But I'm sure there's rubrics online that you can reach out to or create your own with your senior leadership team. So implementation, I wanted to put a lot more questions and answers because it depends on your particular camp. But these are the questions that I think you should answer before you think about how do you want to implement it. We talked about this before, but how will power be shared and used in this body? If you have campers, if you have staff, if you have parents, if you have senior leadership, how are you thinking about power? Are the people with the in senior leadership going to be dominating the group? Are they mindful of how their voice is dominating the group? How will power be shared and used in this body? How do we make sure that we don't have hierarchy? One thing I would definitely suggest is researching consensus building, because this is a way for everyone to be able to share their opinion, but have a non-hierarchical approach to answering questions or making decisions. Everyone can share, but it doesn't sway. So look up the process of consensus building, and I actually do some workshops around that as well, around how to make decisions using consensus. The second question is, how will you shift camp systems to accommodate for the rapid response team? This is probably the hardest piece, because you need to create time for these teams to meet and do the work that they have. So how do you shift the camp day to do that? Are you giving them a lunch period where they can meet as a group and eat lunch with their group, and then senior leaders sit with their tables with their campers and support their co-counselor or whoever? Or do you have a time during an evening or early morning where you're providing coffee? Like, how are you shifting systems to be able to accommodate to this team? The next one is, what does accountability look like? And what structures will be created to ensure this, even for those involved in this group, will be held accountable? So let's say harm does happen. What kind of accountability approaches are we using? Restorative justice is there, but if we don't have that, what is something closer that we can get to that makes accountability fair and equitable for all? And what happens if the people who caused harm are on the team? What does that look like? Because that may and will happen for some folks. Do they also have to step out of the body? What happens if they are not living up to the values of the team? And I highly suggest you creating like a values guide or some kind of community guidelines for the JEDI Rapid Response Team, so they know that if they don't live up to it, that might be a spot that they lose. That's not in the slides, but I definitely suggest creating some kind of community guidelines with them. The next one is continued training, having folks on board who can continue the training, who can meet with them if particular issues keep coming up and they're hitting a wall and they're like, we don't know how to solve this. So having a consultant who you can come to throughout the summer to be like, how do we do this? You can reach out to myself with OAARS, you can reach out to Summer Camp Society faculty or Summer Camp Society staff to see if that's something that they can do on call. So having people on call to solve issues, but also offer continued trainings. Next one is, how will you activate folks who don't get to participate on the team? This is one of the downfalls of what happened originally, was that people put out the rapid response team application and like 40 people applied, and they were like, whoa, I don't think we can handle a group of 40. We don't have the infrastructure for that, especially for the first year. So no, the first year is going to be a hot mess a little bit, but you'll get the hang of it. You'll realize what your camp needs, how to move forward. So just go with the flow. A lot of this is trial and error. So just give yourself grace. It's not going to be a perfect iteration. It never will be. It gets better as you do it over time. The major fact is that you do something. So there's ways that you can activate folks who can't be a part of the team. They can be JEDI team allies, and they can support infusing JEDI at camp in other ways. So they may not get the financial incentive, but if they're really attached to this work, hopefully you can provide other spaces for them to support. Or if they want to do it for free, hey, with no incentives, don't knock them. How will you account for non-related venting with this body? Make sure this body doesn't become a complaining station, which I know I've been a counselor and I've complained a lot when I was a counselor. This is not that space for them. They should have another space where they can vent and talk about issues, but this is not that space. This should be specifically focused on things related to equity and inclusion at camp. That can become overwhelming for the team. What is your process around setting goals for this body? How will you measure success collaboratively? We talked about how do we create evaluation? How do we talk about our goals in the beginning and then evaluate them at the end? Did we meet our goals? If you can do that, that also helps you to get continued buy-in from your campers, from your staff, and in particular, your board. If they can see, wow, this body was able to audit all this and change this at camp in the summer, let's continue this work and invest in it. So make sure you have evaluation so you can get continued buy-in from your stakeholders. And it gives folks on the team some kind of like empowerment that like, yes, we can change camp in some way to make it safer for everyone. And then last but not least, how will you incentivize the program? Monitoring and evaluation, defining your metrics of success. Who are the stakeholders in determining this? Make sure that it's not just success based on senior leadership. Make sure that the people on the team can also determine what success looks like. And that's some of the first community building pieces that you can do. We talked about in-service training, talking about consistently collecting data from the team and general camp population, and revisiting what is working and what is not. So if you have sessions, after the first session, look at, do we see improvement? Is it still working for us? Does this model work for us? Does the decision-making work? So constantly keep checking in with the team to see if there's any pain points and then move quickly to make sure that that changes. If you are part of that pain point, be mindful of that as well and shift accordingly. I suggest also a pre and post camp survey to determine the impact. So if you know what the goal of the team is, you can base your questions on the survey based on what the purpose of the body is. So if the body is to be an auditing piece, you can do questions around like, how did you experience this activity or this tradition? And then at the end of the few weeks, you can say, how does it feel now? What is your thoughts around us auditing this and removing this or amending this, just so you can get some data around impact. And then lastly, determine continued initiatives through feedback from stakeholders. So after the summer, make sure you check in with folks and evaluate like, what's the work we want to continue next summer? Or maybe even, how do we continue this work throughout the year so it doesn't become such a big haul over the summer? How can we create goals? How can we create community? How can we create training throughout the year? And that might be some spaces to activate folks, especially if they're willing to volunteer as well, if you don't have the financial incentives to actually pay them. Okay, the last piece that we're getting to now before we can start taking questions is I just wanted to share some of the takeaways from a camp who actually implemented the JEDI Rapid Response Team and some of their quotes about successes and some of the things that were actually challenging. So of course we start with the good. What went well? So there was a lot of interest. We had a lot of staff, both returnees and first timers, express a lot of enthusiasm about the team and go to multiple meetings throughout the summer. I was actually there when we had the first meeting with this camp about a rapid response team, and the room was full, and I was overwhelmed with how many people who were actually interested in this. So if you feel like staff may not be interested, you might be pleasantly surprised. It was a tangible, concrete system we put in place, even if imperfectly, to help people see we were taking JEDI work seriously. Staff felt this was validating and it helped them feel more heard. Absolutely, during one of those first meetings, people were able to share so vulnerably about some of the things that they loved about camp, but also the places of harm. And they felt heard for the first time because this was finally a question on the table for them to answer and for them not to just vent, but also take action around. And a lot of our camps are talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity and justice, but have nothing to back it up. And this was one way that this camp was able to prove like, we are putting our money where our mouth is. The next one is staff would organically bring up or say, oh, I want to discuss this with the JEDI team. or I want to get the JEDI team's input throughout the summer. It became a part of how the camp community saw they could handle and address issues outside of the typical historical path of reporting it to a head counselor or director. So for some camps, we may be ready for this, and some camps we may not, to change the flow of how do we report things. But this is really empowering that you can see their fellow colleagues, their campers, their peers actually be part of the conflict resolution that happens on camp. So that's one of my favorite quotes from this. We had a handful of issues and microaggressions that came up over the summer, where the JEDI team successfully intervened and helped come up with a resolution that people could get on board with. For example, one instance involved a staff member making a comment about a Black camper being a bad swimmer, which was untrue, and other staff present at the time were extremely offended, as was the camper. The JEDI team was able to mediate a conversation with the camper, who was older and wanted to be involved in the combo, and the counselors offended on his behalf. They proposed additional training for the staff member who made the insensitive comment. So in that moment, they were instantly able to respond as a non-biased body, offer a conversation with the camper about what happened, and involve them in their own solution, and then came up with future training about how to prevent this from happening with the staff member. Instead of just being like, you're fired or you're reprimanded or just yelled at, they came up with both preventative and reparative ways to restore the harm. And this could have gone continuously, where they continuously check in with both the camper and the staff member to make sure that harm was truly repaired. And so that takes a lot of the work off of your senior leadership, because now they can start to handle some of these issues that might be a little bit more complicated. And it empowers them in a different way as staff members and campers, as people who can add to this beautiful culture of camp. Lastly, even in a busy camp summer with lots of challenges regarding COVID, we were able to have consistent JEDI team meetings. So those were some of their successes. Some of the things that didn't go well, which we also have to acknowledge, and you may also experience in your first iteration of this, is the team lacked structure. There were too many people interested, so we suggest having a limit, and a different group showed up at each meeting, which limited how effective each conversation was. We are now putting an application structure in place with a cap on how many people will accept, and compensating people we choose with a JEDI team bonus. By having a cohesive team that we are paying, we can get them to meet and plan before camp preventative actually starts, so they can be more organized and intentional in order to include people who apply but are not chosen, and to involve more members of the camp community. We are also identifying staff allies who will be people the JEDI team can turn to when they need extra support or helping make their ideas actionable. So they limited the team. They came out with the application, because before it was just like, who wants to do it? And then they also activated allies to support the work afterwards. Another weakness was the team was fairly reactive instead of proactive. Last summer, it was a lot of the JEDI team just responding to issues, which is part of what they should do, but they didn't get to actively plan any workshops or camper programming. This summer, we're hoping that they will proactively incorporate JEDI programming into camp life. Example, adding a Juneteenth acknowledgement during orientation, leading a midsummer workshop for other staff on a topic of the team's choosing, incorporating JEDI elements, whether that's more multicultural foods at cooking and education about them, or an expanded land acknowledgement at campfires, etc. And camper activities. We want JEDI work to feel joyful and engaging, and not always just like responding to problems. This is such a beautiful, I love the way they framed their problems, but also gave solutions in the same vein. So they realized that they were just being responsive, which I said is probably not the best thing. We want to be preventative and also a space of learning and unlearning for folks. So now next year, they're going to be shifting to be like, what is the actual purpose? Do we want them to just be responding, or do we want them to actually incorporate things into camp life? And so this camp knows what is best for them now after this first year. A couple more things. The team was focused more on staff issues than camper issues. So being mindful of that, it often became event space, which we talked about, where counselors complained about all sorts of things, not necessarily JEDI related. We hope the above tweaks of proactive versus reactive will help with that. Camp wasn't prepared to put all the JEDI team's thoughts into action, which we talked about with relationship to power. What happens if they suggest things that are challenging your power or something you're not comfortable with? What does that look like? Some counselors call camp leadership out on talking the talk, but not walking the walk. For example, when eliminating or changing our flag raising ceremony came up, we weren't really ready to engage. Cam needed to think through the inevitable obstacles / pushback we were going to face and have a plan for addressing those moments. Even if it was just vowing to hold a circle discussion about the flag ceremony for people to air out their thoughts. We were scared when we felt like something was just too much or too much change and avoided it. So that's really important to know, like, how do we communicate to the team? Like, there may be things that may need a little bit more time to change and it cannot happen rapidly. But that is part of the beginning of creating the team, being really transparent about the power and the scope of power that they have, and recognizing there may be things that we need to talk through in a little bit longer. But what they mentioned here about holding a circle discussion to talk about those things is important. If you shut it down completely and just say no, they know you're not walking the walk. So be mindful of, like, if you know you're not ready to engage on certain things, at least offering the space to discuss it and really hear folks out. Next, we did not communicate enough with our senior leadership. Buy-in from senior leadership is key, and we needed to tell them about the JEDI team, what it was going to look like, and get their input before the summer, even though they are only seasonal staff. We failed to do this, and it took some very important longstanding members of our community aback. Any change is hard at camp, and you need to give people time to process. So it is May now. If you have not communicated this team to your senior leadership and you're thinking about implementing it this year, the time is yesterday. So definitely talk to your senior leadership about it, because they will most likely be a part of it or be responsible for supporting with any instances that come up. So make sure that they are included, that they have buy-in, and that they feel like a part of the process, just so you can make sure of that. So that is the end of my session. I will leave time for questions. Hopefully I can answer them all. If I don't know, you know I'm honest, I will say I do not know, and we'll think about it. But please stay in contact with us, hello@oars.com, but also contact Allison and other folks at the Summer Camp Society, because I am a proud faculty member as well. But thank you all for listening, and I'll open up the floor now for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Simone. That was awesome. I'm sure that we all got a lot out of that, and we do have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak, or you can put it in the chat, or you can do the Q&A function. However you best want more information, we can get it for you. Just let us know. While we're waiting on questions, again, Simone does have some assets for us. I have to get those converted into some files, but they will be sent out next week. So be on the lookout for that. This recording will go up on YouTube next week. We have our 10 late spring hacks, or 10 hacks to make your life easier webinar recording on YouTube now. Chris Price-Dupin did a Do More webinar based on the data from the Trevor Project. That was really good. And that's on our YouTube now. So even more resources for you this time of year. I'm not seeing any questions. I think people are digesting and trying to figure out what they can do this time and how important this is. And I think everyone's with that. I want to say thank you for offering a comprehensive framework. Often these sessions discuss challenges and opportunities, but not how to plan. So yes, it was very practical and tangible. I love that.
Thank you, Heather.
So if you have any questions, like I said, that is OAARS's contact information. You can get Simone there. You can get me at Allison@thesummercampsociety.com, and I will get, we have a question. Okay.
And really quickly, also the framework Allison is mentioning, I will be sending out a job description and a application. So you'll have those two things to work from.
Yeah. The questions are, we have two. I'll start with one. How do we encourage staff who are shyer to participate in some way, shape, or form?
Oh, and then are those two questions together?
No, now we have three questions. They're coming in now. So
look at that. I definitely would say the shyer staff, a couple things. The first one is to really explain the process of what it would look like, because when you think of JEDI Rapid Response Team, you can think of like superhero, you got to be outgoing, you have to like be in the front. But if you explain like it's really intimate, vulnerable meetings with each other, it's like a group process, you don't have to be in front of the room. So really laying out what the details of the work looks like and letting them know that this is also for folks who are a little bit more introverted, because I can do both. Like on Zoom, I'm extroverted, but in person, I'm super shy. So being able to know exactly what those job responsibilities look like in real time is helpful. Another thing is, if you know there is a person who who will be amazing, but they might be a little bit shyer or nervous to engage in this work because they don't know if it's their place, I would say reach out to them. It doesn't hurt to just have a one-on-one about about folks' concerns if you know that they will be a great asset to the team. So definitely tap on those folks and encourage one-on-ones. And then lastly, I would say offer like a town hall or a group discussion or a Zoom where you're talking about any people's questions, and just inviting anybody who's interested. We'll do a group together to talk about what this body can actually be. And so shyer folks feel a little bit more empowered to know like, oh, this is what I'm getting into and can agree to. And if you provide all those things, an individual check-in, a group check-in, and then really explaining the job description, and they still don't want to do it, maybe let them see how it looks for the first year, and then the following year they'll say, okay, this is for me. So provide those spaces first.
Awesome. And how do we encourage buy-in from existing staff who think camp is great the way it is?
That's so funny. It went away. That actually happened at the camp that I was working at. It was mainly the folks who thought camp was great who walked out. They were like, we're good. We don't need to do this. I think that also might take a one-on-one and recognizing like, if you think camp is great for you, we want it to be great for everyone. And if you're truly invested in camp and you're an alumni and you're invested in who we are and what we do, this work is also a part of that. Camp should be great for everyone, not just one person. And this is only a part of making it even greater. And I think also creating a space for them to hear stories of people who may not have always had a great experience at camp, and have them listen to those stories. And they're like, oh, wait, I didn't know you've experienced this at camp, or I didn't know this wasn't a safe space for you at all times. And so if they leave after that, after hearing stories of discomfort or stories of where it wasn't always the greatest for people that they care about, like fellow counselors and campers, and they still don't want to be involved, that just means that they just don't want change, that they are probably not invested in these things, and may need to see an iteration happen over the summer and then maybe be involved the next year. But there may be some people who are just like, I don't want camp to change at all. I don't care if it's not great for everyone. And that's a different kind of conversation you need to have with staff if you see that coming up. But yeah, that's usually what happened that I've seen in some of the camps that I've worked with.
Yeah. We have two more questions, and I think that's all we'll have time for. So that'll be perfect. Do you have suggestions of how this work might look if most of our campers are elementary students?
Oh,
no.
Wait, what it might look like?
Yeah, for elementary.
For me, I don't think that would change. I still think you can have staff involved. And I think elementary school students, even if you wanted them to be involved, you would have to tailor the language, of course, and make sure that it's age appropriate. But you can decide to have them involved or not. But I think an elementary school representative would be amazing. I guess definitely meeting with folks one-on-one or in groups to see who would be the best representative, or people who have the capacity for that work, would be important. But yeah, I wouldn't shift it depending on age. I think it's still necessary. A lot of things actually happen at the elementary school age that people don't have the language for to know that, oh wait, this is an issue of racism or homophobia that happened at the elementary school level. So I think it's still a necessary practice to have.
Yeah, awesome. And then what can we do this summer in anticipation of implementing a JEDI team next summer?
Ooh,
I would say,
yeah, that's a good one. I would say, start getting buy-in from people, starting with the board, seeing what incentives you could provide. I would say start drafting up what your idea of what you want this body to be. I would say start working on your application. So when you do put it out next summer, put it out hopefully earlier in the fall, so you can start getting people on board now to start preparing. That'll be helpful. So start looking at your application and your job descriptions, and then start thinking about how your camp structures can shift based on what you want this team to be and how often you want them to meet and what you want them to do. So those are some steps I would take. I would say get buy-in, work on your application and job description, start thinking about your purpose, and then start thinking about how you shift the camp structure to make this thing work.
Perfect. All right.
And I can share these slides with folks too, because it gives you a lot of those questions and breakdown. You can even go to the implementation slide, I think, that we have here. and start just thinking about that as a team. That could be your first step.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Simone. Again, I'll send out the resources next week. If you get me the slides, and I'll send out the slides next week as well, and the recording so people can come back and watch it. So we'll have that for you. The slides will have Simone's contact information, but you can reach out to me if you need to or want to, and I can get you in touch with Simone. The email should come from me, so you should be able to reply to me if you need anything from us or the Summer Camp Society. But thank you again so much, Simone, and thank you to everyone who came today and everyone who watches this recording. This is so important. Simone, do you have anything else?
No, I just want to say thank you for those thoughtful questions. Thank you for everyone who joined or is listening after. I hope that you start something this summer. That's my only hope for you all.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Have a great day.